Picture this, a queen, draped in shimmering silk, gliding through the grand corridors of a royal palace. Her dress a masterpiece of velvet, lace and heavy embroidery rustles with every step, flowing behind her like a river of privilege and power. She holds her chin high, moves with poise, and speaks with grace. Every glance she makes, every word she utters, is measured, controlled, performed. But behind the polished facade lies a reality no royal portrait would ever dare show. Beneath the layers of corsets and ceremonial gowns is a body real, human, and subject to the same monthly rhythms as any other woman. Yet for queens of the 1600s and beyond, menstruation wasn't just a private matter. It was public business. And not just palace gossip, this was state-level concern. Every cycle was tracked, decoded, reported. Her period could be a sign of hope or crisis. Was she late? Was she pregnant? Had she miscarried? Or worse, was her body failing to produce an heir? These weren't whispered questions among friends. They were formal queries, sometimes discussed in council chambers, or sent in coded messages to foreign courts. A queen's womb was a political institution, her cycle, a national concern. Let's rewind to the royal courts of the 17th and 18th centuries. Back then, a queen's body wasn't seen as fully her own. Her health and fertility were tied directly to the dynasty's future, and so her body became a matter of royal surveillance. Court physicians regularly checked her condition, and her attendants kept detailed records passed along through discreet channels, eventually landing on the desks of monarchs, advisors, and even foreign diplomats. Something as routine as a delayed period could throw the entire court into chaos. Rumors would swirl. Was an heir on the way? Was there a problem with the royal line? Entire political decisions, from royal marriages to treaty negotiations, were delayed or expedited based on the state of the queen's reproductive health. And remember, this was all happening while she was strapped into layers of fashion that made even sitting down a challenge. These royal gowns, they weren't just elaborate, they were architectural. Picture hoops the size of dinner tables, corsets so tight they changed posture, petticoats stacked so high they weighed as much as a toddler. Underneath all that, a queen still had to manage her period. The menstrual cloths used at the time were made of linen or soft cotton, sometimes tied with belts or secured with ribbons. No adhesives, no disposables, just layers of cloth worn under corsets and heavy skirts. Changing them meant undressing partially or fully, which could only be done with the help of trusted attendants, and she might have to do this several times a day. Now imagine trying to sneak away for that during a state banquet, or in the middle of a court ceremony where hundreds of eyes are watching you, and leaving the room might trigger whispers or suspicion. A stain on a royal cushion could lead to a scandal. Was it a miscarriage? Was she hiding something? In a world obsessed with fertility, even the tiniest mark had weight. So queens had to be composed, in control, and always alert, even while dealing with cramps, discomfort, and the constant fear of bleeding through one-of-a-kind royal garments. They didn't face this alone. At the heart of this hidden routine were the ladies-in-waiting. Now, forget what you think you know about court ladies sipping tea and gossiping. These women had critical, deeply personal roles, especially when it came to the queen's menstrual care. Only noble women, often with family ties to the queen, were trusted with these duties. Why? Because this was about politics, not just privacy. A single leak of information about the queen's cycle could be used as ammunition by rival factions or foreign powers. Each month, these women helped change linens, discreetly disposed of used cloths, assisted in wardrobe changes, and monitored the queen's comfort levels. They weren't just maids, they were confidants, spies, record keepers, and guardians of royal secrets. They knew the queen's body better than anyone else in the palace, and they were trained to vanish into the background while doing it. Even the cloths themselves weren't ordinary. Many were custom-made, embroidered, trimmed, or cut from luxurious materials like silk and fine linen. But once used, they couldn't be tossed aside. Not because they were expensive, though they were, but because they were politically sensitive. Each stained cloth was examined, yes, examined for color, texture, smell. Palace physicians believed they could detect health issues, hormonal imbalances, or even poison through these signs. And once they'd been examined, they weren't simply washed. They were ritually cleaned. The process was surprisingly complex. Cloths were first soaked, sometimes in cold water, sometimes in vinegar or salt water. Then they were scrubbed by hand with soaps made from animal fat and lye. These weren't chores for just anyone. Skilled laundresses handled the task under close supervision, with physicians sometimes observing the process. They believed the water itself could reveal clues. In some courts, it was believed that the smell of the blood could indicate disease or pregnancy loss. After washing, the cloths were dried carefully, sometimes pressed and scented, then returned to the queen for reuse. This cycle repeated every month. But while for most women it was just another chore, for a queen it was a highly monitored, deeply scrutinized event. And if her cycle stopped or became irregular, things got even more invasive. If a queen's cycle didn't arrive as expected, the reaction was swift and intense. Missed periods weren't just a sign of potential pregnancy, they were seen as a critical medical and political emergency. And that meant one thing: examinations. These weren't the private, sterile, professional checkups you might imagine today. They were crude, invasive, and deeply uncomfortable. Palace physicians, usually men, would begin by examining the used menstrual cloths, hoping to detect patterns or irregularities. From there, they'd move on to the queen herself. Without anesthesia, proper sanitation, or a full understanding of the female body, these internal exams could be physically traumatic. Queens and noblewomen reported lasting pain, soreness, and in some cases infections that lingered for weeks. But none of that mattered if the royal womb was underperforming. This was especially true in cases where pressure to produce an heir reached a boiling point. Take Queen Catherine of Braganza, married to King Charles II of England. Month after month, when no pregnancy came, she was poked, prodded, and prescribed one questionable treatment after another. The anxiety built. The court watched her every move. And with each failed attempt at conception, the queen's body became less her own and more a site of constant clinical and political scrutiny. It wasn't just about tracking whether she could get pregnant. It was about controlling the entire system around it. When natural cycles stopped or became irregular, the court turned to remedies. And this is where things often took a dark and dangerous turn. One of the most common ingredients in 17th and 18th century fertility treatments: mercury. Yes, mercury. Today we know it as a toxic heavy metal that can cause irreversible damage to the brain, kidneys, and nervous system. But back then, it was believed to stimulate the womb and flush out impurities. It was included in tonics, tinctures, and pills prescribed by royal doctors in full confidence. Women who took mercury often began showing strange symptoms: tremors, fatigue, erratic moods, memory problems. Rather than identifying these as side effects of mercury poisoning, court physicians blamed the symptoms on female hysteria, a popular diagnosis for any behavior that didn't fit the mold of the quiet, graceful royal wife. And mercury wasn't the only hidden danger. Lead was another frequent offender. Lead-based powders were used to lighten the skin, mask body odors, and were even sprinkled on undergarments to keep things fresh. The smell of menstrual blood was considered offensive and had to be concealed, especially in courtly settings. But the long-term cost: reproductive damage, confusion, and in some cases madness. The very efforts to maintain appearances were slowly destroying the health of the women they were meant to protect. If that wasn't enough, bloodletting was also common practice. That's right, even during menstruation, when a woman was already losing blood, doctors would sometimes drain more from her arms or legs. The idea was to restore balance to the body's humors, an outdated medical theory that guided most health decisions at the time. These procedures were done with sharp blades or suction cups, often leaving the queen weak, pale, and more prone to illness. One tragic case that's often brought up in this context is Marie-Louise of Orleans, the first wife of Charles II of Spain. She arrived at the Spanish court at the age of 17, young, terrified, and immediately burdened with the task of producing an heir to a sickly and infertile king. Despite numerous attempts, no child ever came. She was subjected to invasive treatments, bizarre tonics, and constant scrutiny. After years of emotional and physical exhaustion, she died at just 26 years old, many believe from the psychological and medical strain of trying to live up to impossible expectations. And yet, through all of this, queens were expected to appear radiant. There were no off days in court life. No one could know if a queen was in pain, bleeding heavily, or recovering from a procedure. Ceremonies still had to be attended. Balls still required dancing. Paintings still had to be posed for. Royal appearances were planned down to the last ribbon, and even a hint of discomfort could spark speculation. To keep up this illusion, her attendants had to work like clockwork behind the scenes. Secret signals were developed. A subtle touch to the sleeve, a gesture with a fan. These would let ladies in waiting know when a fresh cloth was needed, or when the queen had to excuse herself. Quick wardrobe changes happened in guarded dressing rooms. Cloths were swapped out discreetly. Bodices loosened and retightened. Perfumes dabbed on. Everything done in silence. And despite their importance, these women, her closest allies, were invisible in the public eye. They held her secrets, cleaned her stained garments, and even passed on health reports to court physicians. They ensured the queen could do her job while hiding the fact that her body was going through what every woman experiences. They kept her image intact while protecting her dignity in a world that left no room for it. In some cases, royal women found small ways to express how exhausting this pressure truly was. Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, married to Louis XIV of France, was known for her quiet suffering. After giving birth to a short-lived heir, her inability to continue producing children caused her immense emotional distress. She withdrew from the French court, often citing poor health and fatigue, but in private, letters reveal her frustration at being treated more like a broodmare than a queen. She was surrounded by expectations she could never meet and rarely given space to speak her truth. Her letters weren't public at the time, but they show something powerful. Even royal women felt trapped by the expectations placed on their bodies. They were not just queens and duchesses. They were women dealing with real pain, real fatigue, and real frustration. We tend to remember queens for their jewels, their scandals, their marriages. But rarely do we talk about their bodies. Their real human bodies. The ones that bled, ached, swelled, and broke down. The ones that were examined, judged, and politicized. And maybe it's time we start remembering that part too. Because what these women lived through wasn't just personal, it was structural, systemic. Their pain and their silence were built into the very institutions they served. And yet, they found a way to move through it all with dignity. So the next time you're standing in front of a grand painting of a queen, her face serene, her gown immaculate, take a moment to see past the surface. To imagine the corset cinched too tight, the quiet discomfort hidden behind her smile, the stained cloth scrubbed by candlelight. She wasn't just a queen. She was a woman trying to navigate a world that saw her biology as a tool, a vessel, a symbol. And still she ruled. She hosted. She danced. She endured. That's the untold story of queens and their cycles. A chapter of history written not in ink but in silence, in strength, and in blood.